you want some? Seriously? No? You're going to stick on the gin? Okay, good boy. Hello again, it's David Willey from the Tank Museum. Yes again, not at the Tank Museum, here doing a question and answer session from home on what's now, the sun's coming out, it's a bit grey, windy day, so hopefully I've got the little thing on the mic, hopefully you'll be able to hear without too much interference from all the trees in the background. So let's get on with the usual format. So I've got some questions, I've got some other things here from our shop I'll talk about a little bit later on as we go along, and answer some of the questions you've been sending in on previous. I think this is our number 8th question and answer session that we're on with now. So on with the show. One of the couple of people have brought it up, the issue between live and dead track. What does that really mean? And someone actually answered on one of the comments what I hate to say I thought was a complete load of waffle, because in the sense of I'd never thought there was any confusion about what the difference is, and you know, do come back to us if you think out there is some other definition of live and dead track that's you know, we haven't quite got there. But going to one of the teaching sources, it's very clear here, you know, fairly simple arrangement. So there are two basic types of track pin arrangement, single pin and double pin. Both arrangements can be further classified as live or dead. A live track is one in which the adjoining links are held at an angle to each other by shaped track pins and rubber bushes. Thus, when a section of live track is laid onto the ground, it will tend to curl up. And quite often those bushes are arranged, or the pins are arranged in such a way there's actually a spring in there, so it tries to return it to a certain angle. Dead tracks have circular pins and metal bushes on the lugs. In other words, those bits that come out of a track with the hole in that a pin goes all the way through, they're the lugs. Thus, a section of dead track will lie flat when laid on the ground. This arrangement is also known as dry pin track. So the two really, for as far as I'm concerned in terms of definition, live track has a spring in it, tends to curl upwards, dead track is flat, and that's achieved by what the shape of the pin's going through. On dead track, just a round pin goes all the way through, rotates in there. Live track tends to have a pin that has either, like on CVRT, it's slightly hexagonal shaped pin, and the bushing, the bits in between on those lugs, have shapes, rubber bushing, sometimes with metal inserts that give an angle when those pins go in. So that to me is the difference between live and dead track. So if you think there's another version out there, but that's certainly not one that's that I'm aware of, but do come back to us. So hopefully that answers that one. Josh Wilder asked the issue about when we talk about the restoration of certain vehicles and things going on. He poses that what was often been known philosophically as the ship of Theseus question, and it's one that in the background all museums, certainly with us with vehicles, have to think about. What is the ship of Theseus question or problem? It's this idea that Theseus, a Greek warrior, comes back from a battle, his famous galleon, his ship, is put into harbour, object of veneration, and over time bits of it get rotten, so they're taken off and replaced with a new bit, and the original bits are put in a warehouse on the dockside, sat there over time. Now ultimately, and this was a conundrum that was debated in Greek philosophical times, and as I mentioned, it's still really present. When does that object cease being the original object, as we often call these things, you know, and we always talk in museums about originality, the real thing, etc. If over time the ship of Theseus becomes 100% replacement parts, yet is in the same format, when is the moment that really that stops being the original ship of Theseus? And as is often postulated, all the bits that are saved in the warehouse, if they were put back together again, surely that's now the real ship of Theseus. And as you can imagine, us in a tank museum, any museum, even with paintings, sculptures, etc., you're replacing parts or creating some form of missing bits. There's, as I've mentioned before, in the fine art world, there's fairly, strong conventions about how you illustrate that, how you try and show so that you know over time what's not the original artist's hand, how that's recorded, or in some cases, you know, from a distance it looks fine. When you go up to a painting, you can see the restorers done it in a slightly different manner, or cross-hatching or other ways, so that you can tell this wasn't the original artist's work, it's something that's been replaced later. With 20th century mass-produced mechanical objects such as a tank, you know, what are we really talking about there? What are we saving when we talk about originality? When we know in its own service life, a tank has had many changes, it's had probably new engines, new paint jobs, all sorts of things. You know, is it, what is that inner essence of a tank that you're trying to preserve? And again, you know, back to the conventions, often moved over from the fine art world. What are we doing with historic items? Sometimes we conserve them. In other words, we try and keep everything that was original on the item. We do all we can to try and preserve that originality there, and we conserve what is left, even if the paint's flaking, try and keep that paint on it. Other times we do what they call restoration, which is we try and take it back to a format it once was. So it might be we remove that flaking paint, give it a new paint job so it looks like it was, restore it to that moment in time. We're obviously nowadays moving on much more in a number of areas to replicas. And there's that peculiar, or rebuild, which you might argue, where's that thing in between, where sometimes people get bits of original vehicles or aeroplanes, classic case, or a bit of a sports car, and sometimes we're down to the farcical situation, it's almost a serial number plate off the engine, and a whole new vehicle to the original specifications quite often is built around it. And obviously, you know, much debate goes on, certainly in the museum sphere, but you know, what's the pros and cons of doing these different things? When is it sad to lose originality? What's the significance of that originality? When is it worth really trying to preserve something because of what it shows, it identifies, its evidence there? And when, frankly, if there's another 550 of them, when might it be better to re-represent it to show people what something was really like at the time? And when is a replica just as good? And in so many fields, when you think about it historically, the heritage sector, replicas are regularly being used because of the complexity of things like tanks or steam engines. Only now are we starting to see this rebuilding of steam engines, sometimes to original specifications, sometimes using newer technologies, but to give that sense of here's what a steam engine might sound and look like, etc. And as you know, at the Tank Museum, we've got a couple of replica vehicles. We run our Mark IV replica First World War tank. That was done for film work. We knew, I've told this story before, we knew before the First World anniversaries we'd have pressure, perhaps why not run those remaining First World War tanks that could run. We know they've got issues with them, they've got metal fatigue, they've got a lot of things we need to investigate. So isn't it better that we acquired that replica so it does the job, it looks the part, but it's not actually, let's be honest, a real First World War tank? And that's another one of those really interesting debates in the museum. What harm is there putting together a whole collection of really good replicas or halves and halves and everything else? What difference does that really have than that peculiar, very hard to identify essence of the original that people go to museums to see? You know, you can see wonderful reproductions of works of art. Why do people still want to go to the gallery and see the real thing? What is it about seeing the real thing that gives us that extra dimension, that extra kick, or that association with history, etc.? You know, and that debate goes on obviously in museums, and it's going to be an interesting one with the future as well, post-COVID. You know, how much can we do online? What's still the real thing, etc. So anyway, so there's that. Thanks for the question. It's a really interesting debating issue. You know, a lot of us, you know, we see something like a warbird fly over, you know, the heart beats, you listen to that wonderful sound and everything. It may well be that less than 5% of that warbird ever was around during the Second World War or flew during World War II. It may be all put together by reconstructed parts. Who does that matter to, and when does it matter? So again, you know, so it's one of these ones we can all get quite worked up about sometimes, but have a good think, because there's a lot of subtleties there in some of the arguments, and that ship of Theseus philosophical conundrum is quite an interesting one. So I'm getting showered on here by the by the last of the blossom and some of the leaves coming off the trees. But right, let's continue. Right, thank you. That was Joseph Wilder's question. Top Gun Top Cat asked the question, what Range Rex might we like to recover? In the UK, there's one or two ranges where there's still some quite interesting vehicles. On Salisbury Plain, for example, there's a number of interesting vehicles there. We would like to recover them, even if it's only to help us restore items or potential swap value. So if we could get that interesting turret, we might be able to swap it with someone who's got something we are after. The problem is the remaining interesting tanks, or the ones we particularly find interesting at the moment, tend to be in something called the impact area. Now, the impact area on Salisbury Plain is over, well over a century now of ammunition, artillery, tank rounds, all sorts of things being fired into this one particular area. The area has a lot of what they would call blinds, in other words, unexploded dangerous ordnance. And it was put very clearly to us, the old days, you'd have a couple of EOD engineer guys would turn up with you, clear things out, here we go. Nowadays, as health and safety inevitably encroaches more and more, quite rightly, the range officers have basically said to us, look, unless we're talking about a major exercise, and that might happen one day because, of course, with environmental issues, they may wish to clear some of the old rusting hulks or things that are, on a area of landscape. Salisbury Plain is beautiful area of landscape, and it's got some fantastic untouched earthworks, etc. there, because it's not been ploughed up in the same way as so much of the rest of Britain. So they may have to clear one day, in which case, fine, the world will be there smiling sweetly at the right moment saying, what's the chance of acquiring that one? The other side of it, though, is quite simply, as I say, they've said to us at the moment, we are not going to risk putting soldiers, recovery experts, everyone into that impact area where there are so many blinds, there's so much live ordnance still lying around the place, and risk them just so that we can recover something, that might be a bit of interest to us as tank enthusiasts. So that's the issue there. There are one or two other ranges with interesting, and things are still appearing on the ranges in the UK. We know, I've been abroad, I've seen some amazing vehicles in other countries, in scrap yards or on their ranges, things that, again, like I've said before, quite often a vehicle comes out of service, it might be passed on and sold to another country, it might end up as a hard target, kind of goes down a sort of value in financial terms from that large cost it normally is in service, and then slowly over time it starts creeping back up again. So there's enthusiasts, collectors scouring the world looking for some of these things, sometimes gaining access, buying them, sometimes paying someone to try and gain access to them, all sorts of things going on that way. So material is still appearing, and again, it's always awkward because sometimes people send us the photos and say, look, just for your information, did you know about this? And they don't always want us to share it because, as you can understand as well, not everyone wants every last souvenir hunter descending onto that particular wreck somewhere, either pinching bits or the next minute they're for sale on eBay. And, what it might be quite a complete item ends up being denuded of really important bits, or the real owners, they obviously are cagey about sort of letting these people know about these things. So that doesn't specifically answer, what's the one tank we'd love to acquire. There's some out there, and there's some out there, going back to that earlier question, that we've seen that underneath the later countries' paint schemes, we can see World War II British markings, and where you can almost backtrack that vehicle to a certain degree, knowing it, this is why we know it ended up there. That's the sort of thing sometimes where a vehicle comes not just as an anonymous item, but we know it might have a provenance, or we can actually relate it to a unit, maybe even a crew, one day. Those are the sorts of things that significance, why that's important, why we want to preserve that. You can see that relates to that earlier question as well. And again, watch this space. It's still amazing what's either coming out the ground or being discovered around the world. So, it's an ongoing thing. Someone called Bolt Rider asked the question about when and whom introduced castellated armour. So castellated armour, when we're thinking about the joining there, think of the front plates on a Royal Tiger, on the Panther, where they cut out sections on that front glacé plate and have them meshing in a castellated, like on the edge of a fortification or castle, and they weld them together that way. Who does it first and why? It's the Germans. They've already been doing rebated armour, so other ways, Panzer IV, etc. So jointing the armour in an interesting way before welding on some of their vehicles. But it made me have a look at one of these. I've mentioned them before in one of the earlier episodes of Questions and Answers, what they call British Intelligence Objective Subcommittees reports. And here's one: welding, design and fabrication of German tank hulls and turrets. And in here it's interesting because the British engineers that were doing the equivalent welding, casting, metallurgy in the UK go out to Germany at the end of the war, and of course you can see their judgments as well about where the Germans seem to be, you know, this is new. Where did they think the Germans were getting it wrong? You know, is there national issues going on here as well? But one of the points that's done here is they are specifically looking at that issue, and there's a chapter titled The Influence of Interlock Construction on the Assembly, because one of their points, and I'll read this to you, that they're coming back on, is they don't do this, but they are reporting. And why is it the Germans do this? When they talk to the manufacturers, one of the things that seems to come back is it's a lot of effort, and the manufacturers are not 100% convinced this is really doing what they want, and they have a lot of issues there. So those joints, by the way, a lot of them, again, you'll hear all these different accounts about metallurgy at the end of the war and in Germany, the welds, were they good, were they bad? They're talking in this report up to a third of the welding of hulls of German tanks, a third of the time spent on that is what is called repairing. In other words, the joints don't fit too well, or there's issues going on, and that adds about a third to the time of the overall construction of the hull. It's not coming together easy. And the point they're saying as well, shims, little bits of metal, are being put into these welds. There's an allowance, how much gaps allowed, etc. All the factories, the people in the factories, including these British inspectors, talking to the people there, saying the actual tolerances were completely ignored because it would have taken too long. And there's a quote in here, I'll read to you about that. Houseman stated in interrogation that the time spent on fitting an interlock construction greatly detracted from the gain experienced by gas cutting instead of machining. Apparently firms such as Krupp and DHHV with ample machinery capacity would gladly have returned to rebated joints on the Panther and the Tiger II series. In fact, DHHV had returned to rebated joints on Panther according to Houseman, but due to their having a large stock of prepared plates for interlocking joints, the change was not made in production. No sign was seen or mention of such a change was made when the firm was visited. The firm did state, however, that they did not like the interlock construction, which led to complications in production, but they assumed it was necessary when joining heavy pieces for protection purposes. And when you think about it, what the aim is, the theory behind it is when you interlock together, you're making more surface area for the weld by doing that castellated than a straight butt joint or a simple rebated joint. And also you're adding strength, so by the impact, and that's what all of them are assuming. None of them seem to be part of the design process who are reporting here. But so when you're hit with that trauma force of a round coming in, you've got a more solid join than if it's just butted together that way, so that there's more chance it will take impact and not split. Again, they go on to, there's fascinating material. I can't go into all of it, unfortunately, on these sort of things, but really interested. General remark at the end, Dr. Wasmart, I think his name is, in charge of quality control at DHHV, one of the big manufacturers, the armour plate and welding chassis, stated quite blandly that 100% sound work was not necessary on tanks. Output was the main requirement. So again, when we're judging this, looking at those welds at the end saying, was it lack of materials? In here they're arguing, no, it wasn't the lack of materials. Sometimes it was just the speed of the process they needed to get through. It was getting those vehicles out was more important than making them 100% perfect. So that's you know, literally from the mouth of the manufacturers. So there's quite a bit on there, and also that idea of stepped. There's a photograph here as well as one of the German armoured cars earlier in the war with that faceted shaped body. If you actually look, even there's a little step as almost like a join point to come in. So that idea of the castellation thing, not just as we associate the Panther, the King Tiger, the ones we really think about that. And they also did things called plug joints, where literally there's a hole and another piece of armour. When you were butting the two things together, one piece was actually cut out the side, so it would actually go into that hole, and they called those plug joints as well. But it was something we didn't do so in the Western Allies, which is why, again, for reports like this at the end of the war, they were really looking into those things to find out, you know, if they missed a trick here, is it something we're going to catch up on? So I hope that answers your bolt rider, your question there. I've written it down, but I can't even read my own writing. I think it's Benes Duralaz has mentioned the fact FE4005, our stage 2, that's outside the front of the museum. Huge, great 183mm gun in that slab-sided sort of box-like turret, the second version of where they were looking at this and trying to put a 183 gun on, biggest direct fire gun ever putting on a tank. He's asking, when he went over there and had a look at it, rusty tin work, you know, why is it being let to rust that way? It's one of the problems that we have, which is anything outside in the British climate, as a gate guard, as we often call them, you know, sat out the front of a barracks, or in this case at the front of the museum, the tin work, which is all those added bits, tend to suffer, because however clever you are, you can drill drain holes, you can do all sorts of things, you can angle things, you can release plugs, water inevitably accumulates, rust develops. However good you are at trying to sort of brush off dead leaf, mould, etc., rust develops, which is why in the longer term we're often arguing, saying that, you know, historic vehicles, the old idea, just like you used to go past an RAF base and see a Spitfire or Hurricane out the front, 20, 30 years ago, they were being taken away because they were too valuable, too interesting, getting rarer, etc., and they've been replaced by fiberglass replicas. So back to our Theseus question in a certain way as well. We can't afford to put everything inside. We still like the idea of certain things outside. That FE4005 is actually a bit of a bodge. We managed to get a Centurion hull. I think it was Fort Halstead had one they used for test. We dropped that turret on the top. They weren't originally married together in that configuration, but the Centurion hull was used for the FE4005 experimentation, putting the gun on there. So it's a rehash of what was going on there, but tin work is inevitably something that's going to go. But it is something that is relatively easy to replace compared to some of the other bits that go on vehicles. So tin work tends to be just sheet metal. It tends to be the bits over, for example, the track guards, etc. As long as you've got the solid bit there, such as the bracketing, etc., to support it, we can replace that in due course. So we don't want it to happen. We shouldn't really be letting that happen. But inevitably, we've got vehicles outside. We haven't got enough covered space, even though we built a new, you know, vehicle conservation centre, and we've already run out of room in there. So that's another one of our issues for the future. If we carry on collecting, what are we going to put inside? What do we leave outside? What are the things that, you know, one day, like our range wrecks, etc. But the truth is, yep, you're right. It is rusting, bits coming off it. How important are those bits? That, back to our Theseus question, is a little bit of rusty tin plate on the side as important as what? What's unique about that vehicle? I would argue probably the turret and the gun system, because, as I say, the Centurion hull it's actually dropped on, there's other Centurion hulls around the place. There's nothing particularly unique about that. Someone called Papa has asked the question. Bill Bellamy, he mentions in his book his Cromwell tank. He believed it might have been an unarmoured training vehicle. Is this possible? Yes, it is. I hadn't had the chance, because obviously I've got Bill's book here, but I haven't got access to the archive, where sometimes there are trial reports, and sometimes you actually see, you know, they do an unarmoured version in mild steel, just like in the First World War, the Mark II. They didn't do Cromwell ones as training tanks, as far as I'm aware, but that idea that in the developmental process, vehicles were made. Sometimes a wooden mock-up was done as a space modeler and all sorts of things. Certainly the Germans did that regularly. Then you might have had a vehicle made to test out things, measure things, do crew ergonomics, sometimes in metal but not armour plate, as talking about earlier. Armour plate, it's expensive, harder to machine, etc. So is there a possibility? Now, we've got vehicles in the museum which have the red triangle on because they were very conscious of this in the military. You didn't want things accidentally to get into service that were only either meant for training or testing or something else. So you'll see a red non-armoured, sometimes it writes inside a cast plate on a couple of our vehicles because they weren't done to the full standard and they didn't want that risk. So the chances of him actually getting a completely unarmoured tank out in service in Europe, I think, are thin, but that doesn't mean to say it's not impossible. But I haven't got paperwork here to say, did they even, how many, what happened to, what was the actual test run on those Cromwells, etc. Could it have happened? Was there even a feasible thing there? Or was it just something they believed and therefore it goes in the memoirs that way? Or was it a component wasn't up to spec and therefore they think the whole vehicle wasn't up to spec? So I can't answer that one absolutely with clarity, but it's something the military are very conscious of, as I mentioned. Another one of those questions, a number of people have asked about Tiger reliability. How much is it true? They break down all the time and everything else. And this comes, first time, bit of product placement. We did, I'll quote from our Haynes manual, which I talk about reliability and various other issues in here, which we've still got for sale. And just so you know, that's basically a smaller version. It's got the same information, the same images as the original Haynes one, so it's in a smaller format. So if you can't find this one somewhere, again, we've got that one for sale on our website at the moment. So have a look at that one. But I've put the note in here. And this, I think, is just one of those other ones which, however many times we say it, it's quite hard to get through. Yes, certain tanks were more reliable than others. No two ways about it. That is a truism. But most tanks were unreliable if we try and put it into the mindset of the modern era. I.e., I often say things about it's not like a family car, you don't get in, turn the hand, you have a lot of maintenance to do to keep it going. It breaks down quite often because of the stresses and strains it's under all the way. And so these ideas of what does reliability look like in a tank sort of thing. But with the Tiger, this is what I wrote in the Tiger manual a few years ago. It's not always a good idea. Oh, sorry, reliability. Let me do the right bit. That was mobility. The reliability of the Tiger has also been called into question. The rush design program and the lack of time for genuine trialling of the completed vehicle led to inevitable failures and snags. The failure of seals and gaskets was reported in early vehicles, as was the breakdown in the overstressed drivetrain and new engine. However, Tom Jentz has shown from German vehicle returns from May 1944 to March 45 that the operational availability of the Tiger at the front was as good as the Panzer IV. At times it was better than the Panther, with an average of 70% of Tigers being available on the Western Front compared to 68% of Panzer IVs and 62% of Panthers, and 65% of Tigers being operationally available on the Eastern Front compared with 71% of Panzer IVs and 65% of Panthers. So what we do have to be careful of there is even the crew, and there's quotes in there from the crew where they talk about what they found when they're dealing with the Tiger. And actually, just one thing, I won't read you the whole quote, but there's a lovely line that the guy finishes off with. And he talks about, how many vehicles on a lengthy road drive would still be there at the end. It was the case that if a driver drove without damage for 1,000 kilometres, about 621 miles, he got 14 days leave. And that's from Lieutenant Alfred Rubel, Schwerpanzerabteilung 503. So, the idea that they're recognising that, but they're recognising also that so many of those tanks are unreliable as well. So I think we have a tendency to pick on the Tiger as the problematic tank in that way. Yes, it had problems, but so does the Panther, so do so many other German tanks as well. And so it's hard, trying to put that in a bit of context. One thing though that I did point out in here, which again we overlook, so we say the Tiger, big, heavy, slow. Hang on. Maximum speed of a Tiger, 45 kilometers an hour. Maximum speed of a Sherman, 38 kilometers an hour. T-34, faster still, 55 kilometers an hour. So again, every time we come out with these sort of bland statements about it was slow, it was heavy and everything, careful. Would you have known that a Tiger was faster than a Sherman, in the right conditions? It's interesting stuff. So back to the sail, I'd recommend it. That's a smaller version of it. It's got the same illustrations, the same text in, just a smaller version of it. If you haven't got your Haynes manuals, that's still a really, I would say this would know we wrote it, etc. But it's still got a lot of good stuff, great imagery, a lot of good background stuff on Tigers in there. So do have a look at that one. Adam asked the question, what's happened to our A30 Challenger? It did go out to the Isle of Wight, was going to be restored there. Nothing quite happened over that period it was there. We've got an A30 World War II Challenger, the lengthened Cromwell hull. It sat, unfortunately, on a salt marsh on a range, so it's one of these ones that was recovered. The slab-sided turret many years ago had been sectioned so you could see into it. So it really is, the hull, most of the belly plates fell out. It's got salt corrosion, all sorts of horrible things going on with it. It really is a wreck, but still a vehicle, as I was talking in an earlier question and answer, I think quite an important one, along with Centaur, Cavalier, that shows that British armour story in World War II that we would really like to do. My gut feeling, we'll be able to do a cosmetic restoration on it one day. At the moment it sits in one of our sheds at the museum, looking pretty sorry for itself still, because we haven't really done that much with it since it came off that salt marsh, so it's still got an awful lot of corrosion on it. So back to, as I talked about in an earlier question and answers, priorities, what do we do first? What's likely to happen with one of those, and again, don't get overexcited about us doing it next year or tomorrow type thing. These are major long-term projects that, again, we've got to work out what can we afford, what gives us a return, and how do we undertake major restorations when you're really almost here. You're looking at really an empty hulk that we're starting with. A number of you mentioned about, wouldn't it be nice if we continue these chats after hopefully everything gets back together again as usual. For those who don't know, one of the things we have been doing these chats already, we've been doing them for the last couple of years for patrons. And basically, if you join that system, the patron system for the Tank Museum, you give us a small amount donation per month, I think it is. You can choose a range of what you give. Have a look at it if you think you like this type of thing, because that's what we've been doing. We've been doing these questions and answers for quite some time for patrons. Obviously, at the moment with the museum closed, it seems really sensible to try and open up and give as much content as we can, sort of thing. So that's another one some of you might want to have a look at. I always go on about thank you so much for some of you who've been buying some of the product from the shop. That's a way of supporting the museum. One or two of you, we've changed the postage. Go and have a look again, because we've managed to knock the postage down. Thanks for some of you coming back saying, we halved the postage, so you've been able to order things. But one or two of you have actually made a donation instead. So that's another way of thinking about it. If there isn't anything you want to buy, but you want to try and support us as a museum, and I always say, I know it's difficult times for everybody. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, we've got more money in the bank than we had before. Some of us are losing jobs, so it's a real contrast out there. But if there is something you'd like to do to try and support keeping this going, one of the ways you could do it is perhaps joining that Patreon scheme or one of the membership schemes we've got. And the question and answer sessions we do on a regular basis for patrons. And interestingly, when we did a survey with the patrons, that came back as one of the sort of top things they'd enjoyed about being a patron, was the fact you could ask a question and hopefully, as long as I can find an answer, give you some sort of an answer. So now the ones. Someone pointed out the fact about 19 sets in British vehicles. I talked about American radios last time. Why is it some of those 19 sets have Russian or Cyrillic writing on? Now, they tend to be ones that were made in Canada. The 19 sets designed in Britain, Pi, I just remember the other companies involved, but the 1940, they're very effective radios. used for AFVs. They start getting service in 41 really. We start manufacturing them. I say we as in Canada starts manufacturing them as well to go in British vehicles, and again Canada's manufacturing Valentines, etc. And a number of those are going to go as Lend-Lease or as gift as aid to the Soviet Union. And so with the 19 sets they also put Cyrillic writing on. That's why sometimes you find a 19 set. The ones made in Canada, they've got slight improvements onto the ones made in Britain, but things like valves, etc., the core things are all just interchangeable. So that's why you'll see that Russian writing on some of these. It was part of that program. Not all of them obviously went to Russia, so that's why you'll still find them in British vehicles, Europe, etc. That quite often they're coming out that way. When did Ghost Division ask, when did they start naming tanks in Germany? I think this is another Hitler one, where this idea of the big cats, as it were, so Tiger's the obvious one, up to earlier on. You can look at all the SDKFZ numbers, you can look at all the ways, you know, that the names jump, but they are not given. They're basically either given production names and numbers or codes by the different factories, or the Waffen-Amt imposes those names. It's only when we get to Hitler and the Tiger program do we see names starting to appear. And I think almost, you can't help, it almost sounds a bit like Churchill with he's finding it complex to know the difference between, you know, if you just keep talking about Cruiser Mark 2A or something or other, and the Germans are SDKFZ 13, whatever they're coming out with. So what are we really talking about? I think names help, and it of course gives that impression of power. Tiger, Panther, you know, these are big powerful cats things. So it's Hitler who comes in with this idea of naming vehicles for the Germans. And the Tiger, I believe, is the first one. Someone can come back and have a word on that one. Craig Evans asked, what's the guitar riff at the beginning of our little opening bit? I don't know, I'll be honest. I will try and find out for you. It's presumably something we've whipped off some copyright-free website somewhere and used, but I'll see if I can find out what that particular one is. But we can see, and I'll come back on that one as find out for you. So inevitably, I was going to point out a couple of things connected with questions that have been asked before. A number of you point out the fact I'm a book person. I love books. I've got, you know, the house stuffed full of books, shelves all over the place, always run out of room. Now, those of you who have the same problem as me, one of the things, you sometimes think, I hate getting rid of books, but I do, you know, if I read a novel, straight back to the charity shop, I can get it again. Reference books you always want to hang on to. But if you are running out of room and you want to perhaps downsize some of the things, one of the ones I was going to recommend, if you haven't seen them, Offspray have been doing, I think there are about 4 different volumes of this now, putting their slimmer volumes on British tanks all together and getting people like David Fletcher, who wrote most of those slimmer volumes as well. This is, for example, the British battle tanks, World War II tanks, but he's also filled in the gaps. So they've put all those original Offsprays together in there and filled in to make the story complete. So you've got new material in here as well. And that means you can therefore buy that volume and say goodbye to some of the slimmer volumes. And if you look, you know, David Fletcher, Steve Zaloga, Simon Dunstan, all the British tanks have been covered off there. Steve Zaloga doing the American tanks in British service as well. But there's basically, so you've got most of the 20th century British tanks covered off, and they are very, very good, those Ospreys. And again, with the writing style of David Fletcher, you know, his turn of phrase and everything, it's just wonderful. So there's one I'd recommend. There is new material in these as well, because obviously there was gaps and it's filling that gap, so you've got a more complete story there, and saves a little bit of room on your bookshelf as well. That was one. This was another one. I was going to say, some of you, you know, you come at, as we've said before, different things. That's a great diary. This one, Kelly's War, we've got it at a really good reduced price, £2.99. It's a really good read. It's one of those guys that, like so often when we read this period, they all seem sort of these Edwardian heroes, you know, that go off and fight in the First World War. This guy, he's an Olympic rower, another one of those sort of, you know, blessed with his birth, where he comes from, who he knows. He knows Prime Minister Sam Asquith, he knows Rupert Brooke. He's part of that naval force, the Royal Naval Division. that goes out to Gallipoli, etc. And it's his diary there, and it's yet another one of those, how do you get into the mindset of some of these people in the First World War? And also, you know, this idea that comes across in the pages, because he's a composer of music as well, he's listening to the soldiers' songs and writing those down, and just suddenly seeing, because there they are, cheek by jowl, how that fatalism of, as he sees it, the poor, the soldier there, singing songs about we'll always get the blame for everything type thing and everything, and how that integration of a middle class, sometimes the aristocracy as well, with in that front line, and how that breaks down sort of barriers and things. And anyway, it's a great read. Kelly's War, very good one there for just £2.99. So if you're looking for another one of those First World War reads, I keep mentioning it. If you haven't got it, or you've been looking at, we've just did this one, a new guidebook, really good, beautifully illustrated, nice history of the tank there. So again, if you're getting into the subject, you don't want to go too complex too quickly, but at the same time, this is detailed enough. It's got a lot of good things in there, as well as all these things. I know a lot of you have been asking about, how do guns work? You know, what are those little minutiae, the detailed things? Who does what in a tank and why? And as I mentioned last time as well, we've got all our business about, you know, how do you live in a tank? How do you go to the toilet in a tank? All in that one. So that's a good buy as well. I'd recommend that one if you're trying to find out things. Another one of our t-shirts. I know you like all the t-shirts, all you go. We've got clothing there, hoodies, you name it, stuff. So go and have a look at those on the site. Still got our inflatable shells, which I know has gone down really, really well. There's our 17-pounder one. They've gone down very well, I know. And someone mentioned, and it made me pick it up, I think someone, you know, when I had that nice coat on, the Canadian Mackinac, someone said something, oh, it's a Tintin coat. And I was trying to think, is it? And I like Tintin. Hergé, if you're not a Tintin person, Hergé, cartoonist in the 20s, 30s, comes up with this character, Tintin, who's a journalist. They go on all these adventures, beautiful artwork that he did. Interesting in the Second World War, because the paper he wrote for was closed down. He went, I think it's Le Soir in Belgium, was kind of one of those ones that was run by the Nazis. So at the end of the war, Hergé loses his job, the illustrator, the artist who does these stories, and is criticised for working on a paper that the Nazis were basically, you know, they were backing in Belgium. And he had trouble working again immediately after the war, but gets going again later on. There's obviously that Steven Spielberg movie version. This was the, I just bought that one because if you're like a Tintin fan, that's all the stories that were made into a cartoon type series, that one there, and we've got it as a box set. And if you are a Tintin person, you ought to have that as well. Tintin as well, you know, I'm going off track, I'll shut up. But anyway, really worth watching those ones because they are great adventures, beautiful artwork. And again, it's another representation of Europe and the mannerisms and the language and everything else, which again, if you're getting into your history, how do you pick those things up and how it complements when you're reading Second World War memoirs and everything, so that you know about the language, you know about when they're describing their issues and things, and sometimes just that obscure thing in the words. And Tintin's a bit of a, he likes his clothing and everything else as well, so he's got some fantastic. So yeah, so you end up with five CDs there for the wonderful price of £4.99, so that's not bad going as well. I've been very good, I haven't broken into it. You can buy your chocolate, so again, if you're feeling guilty about buying the book for yourself and you need to buy something else to, I don't know, assuage your guilt as a present for someone, there's your chocolate. And if you get really, really excited, you can even buy Tank Museum Rock. And I wonder if we'll get all these people from around the world now saying, what the hell's rock? Rock is basically a kid's sweet, but in a sort of stick format, and you always bought it when you went to the seaside in England, and it has a name written in it as well, so, or a pattern or something else that way. So if you want to do your impress someone with your traditional English sweets, buy your Tank Museum Rock. And I was going to demonstrate for you. Finn's around somewhere. He's been Finn, what are you eating? Come over here. Come here. So Finn's been playing with the bear. Obviously we do have the bear still. There you go. Go fetch. Go on. So buy your bear. It's not really meant for a dog toy, but I think other people are supposed to be like it. It's going to rip his head off in a minute. So we'll have a. But what, of course, you really do want is for all you draftsmen and everyone else out there. Except I can't find my my pencil now. It's probably gone on the floor. So when it's time for you, that I know you're all going to be wanting to sharpen your pencil, a metal tank pencil sharpener. Rear end, can't find the pencil, so terribly sorry I can't demonstrate it for you. But there we are as well, one of those for your desk ornament thing. And I'm allowed to do this, I've been told, even though it's still the morning in Britain at the moment when I'm filming this. Thank you, Finn. We also have, not only do we have Little Willie beer, we have other beers as well. This is a new one, we did it for Tiger Day. It's a Pilsner, so basically blonde lager beer, Pilsen in what was Czechoslovakia. So this one is actually made by the Piddle Brewery. We have the River Piddle up the road from us, so Piddle Brewery, nice local brewery that do different beers for us. So if you fancy treating yourself, and I am going to use my Tank Museum bottle opener to open up. I've probably shaken it up now, haven't I? No, it's not too bad. So there you go, you can get your Tank Museum key ring. Yeah, I know. He's worried about me drinking at this early in the day, so it's always been a bit of a problem, but I know we've all got that issue at the moment. In our nice 1 pint Tank Museum glasses. So I will finish off as ever by, and I've just managed to get a fly in there. As ever, there's the Pilsner. Finn, come around here. Yeah, I know. Come here, Finn, come back here. So thank you as ever for supporting us. I've as ever gone on a little bit longer than I probably should have had. I'm going to sit here, and now the sun's come out, play with the dog, and drink my beer. Cheers. That's really hoppy. Do you want some? Do you want some? Seriously? No? You're going to stick on the gin? Okay, good boy. In these difficult times, obviously your support is really valued. So please do keep following us on social media, do subscribe to our channel, and if you've got the opportunity, perhaps order something from our shop, join one of our schemes like Patreon or our Friends organisation, and we'll try and keep going with giving you some content to keep you informed and entertained.